Pablo Escobar, the man who built an empire of cocaine and war. Imagine a man who became so powerful that a government was forced to negotiate with him. A man whose organization could move enormous quantities of cocaine across borders, corrupt officials, recruit thousands of people, and unleash violence on an entire country. A man who became one of the richest criminals in modern history. Yet, inside his private world, he was also a father who desperately wanted to protect his wife and children. His name was Pablo Escobar. To some poor Colombians, he was a mysterious Robin Hood who built houses and gave money to the poor. To the Colombian government, he was a terrorist and drug lord. To the United States, he was one of the world's most wanted criminals. And to the people who worked for him, he was a man whose orders could mean the difference between life and death. But how did a boy from Colombia rise from petty crime to an empire worth billions? How did he build a network powerful enough to challenge the Colombian state? How did he move cocaine across international borders? How many people died because of his war, and why after becoming almost untouchable? Did Pablo Escobar eventually end up running for his life through the streets of Medellín? This is the rise and fall of Pablo Escobar. Before the billions, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born in 1949 in Rio Negro, Colombia, and grew up in a relatively modest family. His father was a farmer. His mother was a teacher. Nothing about his childhood guaranteed that he would one day become one of the most feared criminals on earth. But Escobar entered the world of crime early. At first, his activities were relatively small. He became involved in theft, smuggling, and other criminal businesses. Then Colombia entered a period that would completely change Escobar's life. Cocaine. During the 1970s, demand for cocaine in the United States exploded. And Escobar understood something very important. The real money wasn't necessarily in selling drugs on the street. The real money was in controlling the network. Production, transportation, distribution. Money, people, protection, violence. Escobar began building connections with other traffickers. Eventually, he became one of the central figures of what became known as the Medellín Cartel. And that's when his story changed forever. How did he become so rich? Escobar's empire wasn't simply one man selling drugs. It was an enormous criminal organization. The Medellín Cartel brought together several powerful traffickers, including the Ochoa brothers, Carlos Lader, Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, and Escobar himself. The organization operated like a business. There were people involved in transportation, people who handled money, people who protected warehouses and properties, people who maintained aircraft and vehicles, people who gathered intelligence, people who bribed officials, and most frighteningly, people whose job was violence. Escobar also understood the importance of logistics. Cocaine had to leave Colombia and reach international markets. The cartel used aircraft, boats, and other transportation networks to move its product internationally. But here's the shocking part. The scale became enormous. At the height of its power, the Medellín Cartel was reportedly generating up to $60 million every day in drug profits. Think about that. $60 million every day. That is not simply criminal income. That is the financial power of a small corporation. And Escobar had another problem. How do you store that much cash? According to stories from people connected to his organization, enormous amounts of money were hidden in warehouses, properties, and other locations. Some cash was even damaged by moisture or rodents. And that tells us something important about Escobar's empire. His biggest problem was not always making money. Sometimes it was finding somewhere to put it. The people behind the empire. When people hear the name Pablo Escobar, they often imagine one man. But one man cannot run an empire of this size alone. Behind Escobar was a huge network. The exact number of employees and associates is difficult to establish because the organization was decentralized and many people worked indirectly for the cartel. But the network included pilots, transporters, accountants, lawyers, informants, corrupt officials, guards, smugglers, and armed killers. And then there were the sicarios. The sicarios were contract killers who carried out murders and other acts of violence. Some were extremely young. Escobar's organization recruited people from poor neighborhoods, especially young men who saw criminal work as a path out of poverty. Money gave them status, weapons gave them power, and Escobar gave them an identity. But there was another side to the system. Loyalty was rewarded. Betrayal could be fatal. That was one of the secrets behind Escobar's power. People didn't simply work for him because they liked him. Many worked for him because they feared what would happen if they refused. The Robin Hood image. But Escobar understood something that many criminals never understand. Money can buy more than luxury. Money can buy loyalty. In poor neighborhoods of Medellín, Escobar gave money to families and funded housing and community projects. He built houses and soccer fields. For some people, he became a symbol of hope. This created a strange contradiction. The same man who was associated with enormous violence could also be celebrated by some poor Colombians, and Escobar deliberately encouraged this image. He wanted people to see him as a man who helped the poor. But there was another reason. If people loved him, they were less likely to cooperate with the police. And if people feared him, they were even less likely to betray him. That combination of generosity and terror became one of Escobar's most powerful weapons. But when a drug lord entered politics, here's something many people forget. Pablo Escobar didn't only want money, he wanted political power. In 1982, Escobar entered Colombian politics and became an alternate member of the country's Chamber of Representatives. Imagine that. A man building a massive cocaine empire was entering the political system of the country. But journalists and politicians began investigating his background. One of the people who publicly challenged him was Colombian Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. Lara Bonilla helped expose Escobar's connections to organized crime. Escobar's political ambitions began collapsing. And this was the beginning of a much larger war. The war against extradition. One issue terrified Escobar more than almost anything else: extradition to the United States. Colombia and the United States had an extradition treaty. For Escobar, being sent to an American prison was almost unimaginable. He wanted to be imprisoned in Colombia, where he believed he could maintain much more control. So Escobar and his allies began fighting extradition. Not only through politics, but through terror. The message was brutally simple. Better a grave in Colombia than a prison in the United States. This became one of the most important ideas behind his war. He attacked the state. He threatened politicians. He targeted journalists. He used bombs and assassinations. The violence escalated dramatically. The Medellín Cartel had effectively declared war on Colombia. The bombs that shocked Colombia Escobar's organization became associated with some of the most devastating acts of violence in Colombian history. Politicians were assassinated. Judges were threatened. Police officers were targeted. Journalists were murdered. And bombs exploded in cities. One of the most infamous attacks was the bombing of an Avianca passenger plane in 1989. The bombing killed 110 people. Another major bombing targeted Colombia's Administrative Security Agency, the DAS, in Bogota. The goal was not simply to kill individuals. The goal was to create fear. Escobar wanted the government and the public to understand that his organization could reach almost anywhere. And that was what made him so dangerous. He wasn't simply hiding from the government. He was trying to force the government to surrender. How many people did Escobar kill? This is where we need to separate history from legend. You will sometimes hear claims that Pablo Escobar personally killed thousands of people. The reality is more complicated. Escobar was directly and indirectly responsible for enormous violence, but there is no universally accepted number for how many people he personally ordered killed. The Medellín Cartel was responsible for assassinations, bombings, kidnappings, and attacks on the state. Escobar was also associated with the murders of major political figures, police officers, judges, journalists, and rivals. Some estimates attribute thousands of deaths to Escobar and his organization, but the exact figure remains disputed. So the most accurate way to say it is this: Escobar was responsible for a vast campaign of violence that killed thousands of Colombians. But historians cannot give us a perfectly reliable number of victims personally ordered by Escobar, and this distinction matters. Because the real story is already horrifying enough. It doesn't need exaggerated numbers. His weapons and military power. How powerful was Escobar when it came to fighting? He wasn't a conventional military commander. He didn't have an army in the traditional sense. But he controlled armed men, weapons, vehicles, intelligence networks, and enormous financial resources. His organization could recruit killers and obtain firearms and explosives. It could conduct assassinations. It could carry out bomb attacks. It could fight rival criminal groups. And it could attack government institutions. But there was a limit. Escobar could terrorize a country. But he couldn't become the Colombian army. This distinction would eventually become critical. Because every time Escobar escalated his war, the Colombian government became more determined to destroy him. And eventually, the United States became deeply involved. Escobar versus the United States. The United States considered Colombian cocaine trafficking a major threat. American law enforcement agencies pursued the Medellín Cartel and its leaders. The cartel's international network became a major target. Escobar responded by trying to make himself too dangerous to extradite. But this strategy created a problem. The more violence he used, the more enemies he created. The more enemies he created, the more intelligence the government collected. And eventually, the war became much larger than Escobar. It became a battle involving Colombian police, intelligence agencies, American authorities, rival traffickers, and former allies. Escobar was slowly becoming surrounded. The most unusual prison in history. In 1991, Escobar surrendered to Colombian authorities. But there was something extraordinary about his imprisonment. He was allowed to remain in a prison facility that he had enormous influence over. It became known as La Catedral. It was nothing like a normal prison. Escobar reportedly continued to exercise influence from inside. But eventually, the Colombian government decided it had to move him. Escobar escaped. And now, the greatest manhunt in Colombian history began. The manhunt. Escobar was no longer the untouchable king. He was a fugitive. Police hunted him. American authorities helped Colombian forces with intelligence and expertise. And a group known as Los Pepes, made up largely of enemies of Escobar, also targeted his organization. Escobar's empire began collapsing. People who once worked for him started disappearing. Others surrendered. Some betrayed him. His money could no longer solve every problem. His enemies were multiplying, and his family was becoming increasingly important to him. The man who loved his family. This is one of the most complicated parts of Escobar's story. Pablo Escobar was a brutal criminal, but people close to him described him as deeply attached to his family. His wife, Maria Victoria Henao, and his children were extremely important to him. Escobar wanted to protect them. He wanted them to have money. He wanted them to be safe. But there was an enormous contradiction. The same man who wanted his children protected had created a world in which thousands of other families had lost fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. His love for his own family did not cancel the suffering caused by his criminal empire. And eventually, the violence he created came back toward the people he loved. His family had to live in hiding. They were forced to move from place to place. And Escobar became increasingly desperate. Oh, the price of his dream, Escobar wanted three things: money, power, and protection from extradition. He achieved the first two, but the price was enormous. He lost political influence. He lost allies. He lost members of his organization. He lost his freedom. He lost his ability to move openly. And eventually, he lost his life. This is one of the greatest lessons of his story. Escobar believed that enough money and enough violence could make him untouchable. For a while, he was almost right. But almost wasn't enough. December 2nd, 1993. By 1993, the manhunt had narrowed the search. Colombian authorities eventually located Escobar in Medellín. On December 2nd, 1993, Colombian security forces surrounded the building where he was hiding. Escobar tried to escape. He climbed onto the rooftops. Gunfire followed. And then, Pablo Escobar was shot and killed. He was only 44 years old. His reign had ended. The man who had once controlled enormous wealth and terrified a government was dead on a Medellín rooftop. History describes his death as the culmination of one of the largest manhunts in history. The legacy of Pablo Escobar. So what should we remember about Pablo Escobar? Not simply the money, not the cars, not the mansions, not the private aircraft. And certainly not the myth that he was some kind of heroic Robin Hood. The real story is much darker. Escobar proved that enormous wealth can buy influence, that fear can create temporary loyalty, that organized crime can become powerful enough to challenge a government. But he also proved something else. No criminal empire is invincible. The same system that made Escobar powerful eventually destroyed him. His wealth created enemies. His violence created enemies. His political ambitions created enemies. And his war against extradition created enemies. At the end, Escobar had billions of dollars, but nowhere safe to hide. He had powerful connections, but fewer and fewer people he could trust. He had armed men, but the government was closing in, and he had a family he loved. But his criminal empire had placed that family in danger. Pablo Escobar wanted to become too powerful to be controlled. Instead, he became a prisoner of the empire he created. His story is not simply the story of a billionaire drug lord. It is the story of ambition without limits, power without accountability, and a man who believed he could defeat an entire system, until the system finally found him. Pablo Escobar died on December 2nd, 1993. But the consequences of the empire he built did not die with him. The Medellín Cartel collapsed. Other organizations rose. And Colombia continued to deal with the legacy of the drug war for years. The question is not simply, did Pablo Escobar become so rich? The more important question is, What did it cost him to become that rich? Because in the end, Pablo Escobar had almost everything money could buy, except the one thing he could never purchase: a way out.